It was supposed to be routine. A flight like any other, packed with returning workers, a few students, and a handful of tourists heading home before the holidays. American Eastern Flight 609 lifted off from Houston International Airport on October 29, 1987, under a clear sky and a calm tower. The Boeing 707 was scheduled for a transcontinental journey, with stopovers in Florida Keys and Miami before reaching its final destination in Washington, D.C. There were 115 souls on board. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The plane stopped in Florida Keys as planned, offloaded 15 passengers, and took on fresh fuel for the next leg. Among those who disembarked were 2 travelers who raised no alarms: an elderly man with silver hair, listed as Hugh Rayner, and a young woman with striking features, noted on the manifest as Isabel Rayner, his daughter. They were calm, quiet, and ordinary. If anything, they seemed in a rush. The gate staff remembered how they asked for directions to the Panama-bound terminal almost before the jet bridge retracted. Within 30 minutes, they had vanished into the crowd. No one knew at the time that these 2 individuals were the key to a disaster that would unfold just hours later. A flight that never landed. At approximately 2:18 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Flight 609 contacted Florida Regional Air Traffic Control one last time. The pilot reported an altitude of 37,000 feet and confirmed clear weather ahead. The plane was expected to land in Miami in less than 90 minutes. Nothing. No distress call. No radar ping. No warning. Flight 609 simply vanished somewhere above the Gulf of Mexico, just 130 miles off the coast of Key West. It took less than 20 minutes for the control tower in Miami to realize something was wrong. They couldn't raise the aircraft. They tried again. Then again. Nothing. By 3:10 p.m., the FAA issued a full alert. Initial assumptions: engine failure or weather. At first, the narrative was simple: mechanical failure. The 707 had been in service for nearly 20 years. Outdated. It had even experienced landing gear issues 2 months prior while touching down in Seattle. Pilots were forced to belly land on the tarmac after hydraulic systems failed. No fatalities, but the fuselage took serious damage. The plane had been repaired and cleared to fly again. But the idea of another malfunction, this time over open water, made sense. That was the first theory. Rescue teams from the U.S. Coast Guard, Florida Marine Patrol, and Navy units from Jacksonville began combing the search area by late afternoon. Helicopters, sonar, divers. They swept the Gulf for any trace: floating luggage, wreckage, oil streaks. For 48 hours, they found nothing. And that's when the questions began. Doubts begin to surface. A plane that size, even if torn apart midair, leaves something. But there was no debris. No radio call. No emergency beacon. Just silence. Then came the troubling realization: 2 passengers had exited the plane just hours before the disappearance. And they hadn't simply gone home. Customs in Panama, reviewing flight logs and security footage, confirmed that Isabel and Hugh Rayner had purchased immediate tickets to Lisbon, Portugal, under their Canadian identities. But when their names were flagged by Interpol due to inconsistencies in their passport data, immigration officers intervened. They were detained at Tocumen International Airport just as they were boarding their transatlantic connection. At first, the detainment appeared routine, a case of suspected forged documents, nothing more. That was until both detainees asked for a cigarette during questioning. Skull the act that changed everything. The interview room was quiet. 1 fluorescent light above. 2 officers watching from behind a 2-way mirror. A translator standing by. Hugh lit his cigarette first. Took a single drag. Then he collapsed. Convulsions began instantly, violent, unmistakable. Isabel hesitated, her hand shaking, cigarette halfway to her lips. But by then, the officers were already moving. They knocked it away, restraining her as she began to seize. Both had tried to ingest poison through the filters of their cigarettes. A suicide pact. One succeeded. One failed. The girl who lived, Isabel Rayner, or whoever she was, survived. Barely. She was transferred to a secure military hospital in Panama City under full sedation. monitored around the clock. And once she woke up, the real mystery began. Because what she told investigators next would send shockwaves through every agency from Washington to Langley. Her story was fragmented at first. She spoke in heavily accented English, claimed to be Chinese, gave a birth name that didn't appear in any records, claimed she had been raised by an old man in Macau and was just trying to reach Canada. But it didn't add up. She described cities that didn't exist, couldn't recall her own supposed hometown, claimed she spoke Cantonese, but slipped up in Mandarin. And then, one of the interrogators asked her, offhand, what kind of television she had at home. She replied, Kim Darn. There is no such brand in the United States. But Kim Dar was the primary manufacturer of state televisions in North Cassia, a closed-off authoritarian state known for its covert operations and militant propaganda. It was the first undeniable crack in her facade. Ending part 1 hook, a deeper web. That evening, the girl who called herself Isabel Rayner stopped speaking altogether. But the damage was done. The chain had begun. An entire passenger jet had gone missing over the sea. 115 people, gone. A girl with no identity, held in custody. A poisoned cigarette, a fake passport, and a lie too deep to untangle in a single night. But the question remained, who is she? And what was her mission on Flight 609? 2 names, 1 lie, the spy who survived herself. She claimed to be a daughter, a tourist, a witness, a victim. But with every word she said, something deeper unraveled. The hospital lights were sterile. Too white. Too clean. That was the first thing she noticed when she opened her eyes again. Isabel Rayner, the name she had offered to authorities in Panama, was now under 24-hour watch. The poison hadn't killed her, but it had come close. Close enough to leave her barely coherent for the first 72 hours. She was handcuffed to the bed. Not out of cruelty, but precaution. This was no ordinary detainee. A plane was missing. 115 people presumed dead. And she was the only known person who had walked off that flight alive. The first interrogation. Her voice was hoarse when she finally spoke. She didn't mean to hurt anyone. It was the first sentence that didn't match the eyes. She introduced herself, again, as Lan Mei, born in 1964 in Zhuhai, southern China. Orphaned young. Raised by her grandmother. Picked up by a Canadian businessman who brought her to Vancouver. That man, she said, was Hugh Rayner. He adopted her. She never knew her real parents. The story had shape. But no weight. No school records. No immigration entries. No Canadian registry under her claimed name. Nothing. FBI analysts flew in by day 4. The room changed. The questions deepened. They began probing the details. What village in Zhuhai? What dialect did she speak growing up? What was the name of the school she last attended? Lan Mei, or Isabel, or whatever her name was, couldn't answer most of them. When pressed, she claimed she forgot. Trauma. One investigator, a linguist from the CIA, noted a peculiarity. Her accent, though intentionally softened, wasn't Southern Chinese. In fact, it wasn't Chinese at all. It was clipped. Northern. With traces of Japanese phrasing buried beneath fluent English. They had heard it before. Not in Vancouver. Not in Zhuhai. But from defectors. From spies. Slips of the tongue. Her first real mistake was almost casual. During an unscripted break, an officer asked her offhand, "What brand of TV do you have back home?" Without hesitation, she replied, "Kimdar." The room went silent. Kimdar wasn't available in any Western market. It wasn't Canadian. Not Chinese. It was a domestic-only television brand manufactured exclusively in North Cassia, a reclusive and sanctioned nation long suspected of sponsoring covert operations abroad. They hadn't mentioned North Cassia in any question. Ever. She had walked right into it. It was the first time anyone believed her real story might be unraveling. The mask begins to slip. Still, she denied everything. She stuck to her orphan tale. When questioned in Korean, she showed no reaction. No understanding. But the agents didn't stop there. During a routine session, one of the officers, speaking in Korean just loud enough to be overheard, whispered, Look at her hands. They've clearly been trained. Delicate but too steady. The woman immediately pulled her hands into her lap. A reflex. Subtle. But there. Another time, they deliberately told a joke, a dry, sarcastic one about Vancouver winters, in Korean. She didn't move. No smile. Nothing. But moments later, in the restroom, with the faucet running, she laughed. Quietly. As if the punchline had taken just a moment too long to sink in. They were watching everything. She had been trained not to react. But training only goes so far. Mind games and the war of patience. Still, she said nothing conclusive. No admissions. No guilt. She ate barely. Slept rarely. Spoke only when necessary. The FBI grew impatient. There was pressure. From the press. From the families of the missing. From the upper levels of government. Was she the key to unlocking what had happened to Flight 609, or just a well-trained puppet? A few agents suggested pressing harder, solitary confinement, aggressive interrogation. But the lead investigator, Special Agent Thomas Greer, took a different path. She's not afraid of pain, he said quietly. She's afraid of truth. So they stopped questioning her and started showing her the world. On day 11, under tight federal escort, the woman they still called Isabel Rayner was walked, anonymously in civilian clothes, through Midtown Manhattan. She saw Times Square. Cafes. Street musicians. Children eating ice cream beside the Chrysler Building. She watched two teenagers laugh at a street magician who made coins disappear under a baseball cap. A woman with a stroller offered her directions when she appeared lost, with no suspicion, no hostility. Back in the hotel suite turned safe house, they let her watch television. She saw morning news, late-night comedy, old reruns from the 70s. Cartoons. Advertisements. And none of it, looked like the America she had been told existed. There were no starving people in alleys. No police roaming with rifles. No broken cities drowning in chaos. It was the first time she cried. The confession. It happened on the night of December 23rd. There was no formal setup. Just an agent in the next room, the television humming low, and a notebook left on the table. She picked it up and began writing. In tight, deliberate strokes, she wrote 4 words. My name is Kimberly. That was the first line. The rest followed like floodwaters breaking a dam. She confessed her real name, Kimberly Yuen. She was born in 1962 in the capital of North Cassia. Recruited at age 18. Trained in language, explosives, disguise. Paired with veteran agent Victor Sun, who posed as her father. Mission: infiltrate and destroy Flight 609. They had planted a time-delay explosive in an overhead storage bin, disguised as a portable cassette player. Activated with a built-in barometric trigger, it would detonate at cruising altitude, guaranteeing total destruction. The goal: derail international peace talks by instilling fear. Show the world that America was not safe. Scare away its allies. They hadn't expected to be caught. The plan was perfect. Until it wasn't. That night, she handed the notebook to Agent Greer. I thought I knew what freedom was, she said, her voice even. But I've never felt it until now, and that's what scares me the most. She sat in silence, head bowed, waiting for the handcuffs. But they never came. Because now, she wasn't just a suspect. She was the only witness to one of the darkest operations ever executed against American soil. And her story was just beginning. The debris they didn't want to find: politics, lies, and the election connection. The truth had a pulse. But for some reason, no one wanted to hear it beating. The confession was out. Kimberly Yuen, the woman once known as Isabel Rayner, had admitted to one of the most horrifying acts of air terrorism in American history. She had walked the authorities through every step. How the bomb was built. How it was disguised. Where it was placed. What it was meant to destroy, not just lives, but trust. Fear was the objective. Fear that would ripple across borders and cancel peace talks. Fear that would remind the world. America could bleed. There was just one missing piece. The plane. Compass the ocean that swallowed everything. American Eastern Flight 609 had disappeared over the Gulf of Mexico. The suspected detonation point, based on radar loss and flight trajectory, placed the explosion approximately 137 miles southwest of Key West. Deep water, remote, difficult. But not impossible. Black boxes on commercial airliners are designed for the unthinkable. They're fitted with underwater locator beacons, ULBs, that ping every second for up to 30 days. These devices don't float, they sink, but they scream. If someone wants to find them, they can. And that's what made the next part of the story so strange. Magnifying glass tilted left, the search that wasn't. The official search lasted exactly 16 days. The Coast Guard announced that recovery operations were suspended indefinitely due to environmental challenges, fragmentation of debris, and the presumed depth of wreckage exceeding 9,000 feet. That statement was partially true, but not completely. Internal reports later revealed that sonar mapping of the area showed debris scattered at depths between 120 and 200 feet, shallow enough for specialized Navy divers. Multiple countries had offered advanced submersibles to assist. France, Japan, even Mexico. But the U.S. declined. Even more suspicious? Fragments of the aircraft had already been recovered, small, twisted metal pieces washing ashore on barrier islands near Florida's west coast. Locals found them. Not the military. Not the government. But beachcombers and fishermen. Rolled up newspaper, a press conference with no proof. Despite having Kimberly's confession, the government refused to confirm the cause publicly. No images. No physical evidence. No black box. Just a statement. We believe Flight 609 suffered an explosive decompression at high altitude, consistent with sabotage. The media pounced. Some outlets supported the official version. Others tore it apart. If we know it was a bomb, one anchor demanded on live television, where's the proof? The FBI stayed quiet. The FAA deferred to Homeland Security. And the White House? Well, the White House had its own reason to stay silent. Ballot box with ballot, the election that changed the tone. December 16, 1987. Just one day after Kimberly was flown back to U.S. soil, America held its most pivotal presidential election in nearly a decade. The nation was divided. The frontrunner, Senator Calvin Monroe, a hardline conservative and former military general, had campaigned on one promise. Security first. Talk later. His rival, Governor Elias Warren, leaned heavily into diplomacy. International cooperation. Then Flight 609 disappeared. And the narrative changed overnight. Suddenly, Monroe wasn't just a candidate. He was the protector. His polling numbers soared. Every debate clip of him vowing to neutralize foreign threats played like prophecy. When the results were tallied, Monroe won by the widest margin since Reagan. Brain too convenient? There were whispers. Did someone know ahead of time? Why didn't they search longer? Why bring Kimberly home right before the election? Journalists requested freedom of information documents. Many were denied under national security grounds. A few came through, heavily redacted. Entire pages blacked out. One paragraph in particular stood out. Given proximity to political timeline, recommend minimum media exposure of recovered fragments. Let narrative anchor around testimony. Easier to manage. That sentence, dry, bureaucratic, spoke volumes. It wasn't about the truth. It was about control. Speaking head, Kimberly speaks again. In early January 1988, Kimberly was relocated to a secure holding facility in upstate Virginia. Quiet, cold, guarded but not cruel. She began writing again. Not confessions, this time reflections. She wrote about the training, the scripts, the indoctrination, how she had believed America was a crumbling empire, how she'd been taught that every citizen lived in fear, every building was broken, every voice was silenced. But she saw Manhattan. She saw freedom. Messy, loud, chaotic freedom, but freedom nonetheless. The scariest part of waking up, she wrote in one letter, is realizing I never asked to sleep in the first place. Two sides of the same war. The government had a choice: prosecute her as a mass murderer or preserve her as a witness. They chose the latter. On March 27, 1989, Kimberly stood before the federal court in D.C. She was found guilty on 117 counts: terrorism, conspiracy, unlawful use of explosives, and 115 counts of first-degree murder. Her sentence, death. But 3 months later, something unexpected happened. President Monroe granted her a full pardon. The official statement read, "Kimberly Yuen was not the mastermind. She was a product of coercion, a pawn in a global war she didn't choose." Unofficially, the reason was simpler. As long as she lived, she was living proof of a real attack. A narrative too politically useful to erase. She wasn't a hero. She wasn't a victim. She was a living weapon, one that now belonged to a different side. And somewhere, deep in the Gulf, lay a sunken plane no one wanted to find. From pawn to prisoner, the spy who became a housewife. She helped destroy a plane. But she couldn't remember what her favorite color was. She was 27 when the country she was trained to hate gave her back her life. The courtroom had gone silent when the president's pardon was announced. Even the prosecutors sat stunned. A woman who had admitted to participating in the deaths of 115 people was going to live. The headlines raged for weeks. Terrorists turned testimony. Why did we let her walk? Was it worth the mercy? But after the cameras turned off, after the news cycle moved on, after the last interview request was denied, Kimberly Yuen vanished again, not into shadows, but into suburbia. A prison of quiet streets. She was relocated to a federal witness protection program under an assumed identity. New name. New documents. New past. No one in the quiet neighborhood in Northern California knew the soft-spoken woman in the white two-story house with the trimmed hedge and always closed curtains. They just knew she kept to herself. Some said she was recovering from a trauma. Others thought she might be a widow. A few whispered that she was some kind of former federal agent, polite, but too alert. Only a handful of people in the country knew the truth. The woman baking banana bread at 3 p.m. on Tuesdays had once been trained to kill with her bare hands. The life no one talks about. She had rules. Rule number 1, never speak to reporters. Rule number 2, never confirm who you are, even to yourself. Rule number 3, no phones with tracking. No international travel. No internet in her name. She cooked. She gardened. She adopted a cat she named Milo, a stray with one eye missing. Every Thursday, she walked to the market wearing a wide sun hat and large sunglasses. Not to hide, but because she no longer knew who she was without them. The dreams that don't fade. Nightmares were frequent. Not of the plane. Not of the explosion. But of before. Of the concrete training compound in North Cassia. Of the silent halls lined with maps, audio recorders, and faded portraits of long-dead generals. Of the smell of bleach and sweat and chalk. And of Victor, the man who had raised her like a father, trained her like a soldier, and died by her side trying to keep a secret that didn't matter anymore. Sometimes she'd wake up whispering his name. Sometimes she'd wake up feeling nothing at all. Love in the least likely place. He was supposed to be her security detail. John Bellamy, mid-30s, former military, assigned to rotate surveillance shifts every 12 hours at her designated safe house. For months, they barely spoke. She would leave tea on the counter, and he would nod. One night, during a rare rainstorm, the power went out. He was reading by flashlight. She stood in the doorway and said softly, "I used to believe freedom meant living without mistakes." He replied without looking up, "It doesn't. It means being allowed to live after you've made them." They got married the next year. The children who didn't know. She gave birth to 2 children, a boy and a girl. They were bright, curious, and full of laughter. She never told them what she had done. Never mentioned where she was really from. Never spoke a single word of her old life. To them, she was Mom. The woman who packed their lunches, stitched their Halloween costumes, and taught them how to make dumplings from scratch. But some days, when they played near the hallway closet, she would stand frozen, half expecting to hear an agent's knock, a plane overhead, or a name she no longer used echoing off the walls. Memoirs under pseudonyms. In the mid-90s, quietly, under government approval, she published a book titled Echoes in the Sky, a fictionalized memoir that read like a novel, but every sentence carried the ache of truth. In it, she never mentioned a country, never gave a date, but she described a girl trained to hate who learned to feel. A mission that cost hundreds of lives, and one that still echoed through her spine every morning when she opened her eyes. The book became a bestseller in Japan and parts of Europe, but in America, it barely made a dent. The publishers were told, off the record, not to promote it. Better if she fades away quietly. A ghost on the screen. In 2009, something changed. A Japanese news crew arrived unannounced at the local library where Kimberly had volunteered part-time. One of the reporters was the son of Yo Tagawa, a Japanese woman abducted by North Korea in the 1970s, rumored to have trained foreign operatives. He had spent 30 years chasing whispers. Kimberly agreed to meet him. They spoke in Japanese, slowly, carefully. When he showed her a photo of his mother, Kimberly's hands trembled. She whispered, "She was kind. She never wanted to teach us, but she was kind." That moment aired quietly on late-night television in Tokyo. In America, it never made the news. Still haunted. In 2013, after 2 decades of silence, Kimberly agreed to appear in a low-profile interview for public broadcasting titled, "The Last Passenger, A Confession." She wore a cream cardigan. Her hair was streaked with gray. She looked like someone's aunt, someone's neighbor, someone who might have baked cookies the night before. But her words were clear. "I deserved to die, but I was allowed to live. So now I bear witness, because no one else can." Her story never became a headline again. She aged. Quietly. Softly. Sometimes she would walk by the local elementary school and pause, listening to the children scream in joy during recess. She would smile, and then walk away before anyone could see the tears. She never flew again. Not because she was afraid of crashing, but because she knew too well what it felt like to fall from the sky. Before she was Kimberly, the making of a weapon. She wasn't born dangerous. She was shaped, word by word, silence by silence, lie by lie. She had a different name once. A name spoken in whispers behind concrete walls. A name that wasn't meant to be remembered, only used. Long before she was Kimberly Yuen. Long before the world knew about Flight 609. She was just another girl in a country that didn't allow children to dream. Her real name was Han Usio. She was born in the capital city of North Korea, in a government-guarded district known only by number, Sector 12A. Her mother was a schoolteacher. Her father, a foreign diplomat with limited rank but full allegiance. On paper, they were privileged, protected, loyal. And yet, when she turned 7, they stopped calling her by name altogether. They called her asset in development. The school with no windows. She was removed from public education before her 8th birthday. Her new school was located outside the city, a repurposed military facility surrounded by pine forest and electric fences. There were no bells, no recess, no colors. There were no mirrors. The children, around 30 of them, lived in silence. Each had a number. Hers was K7. Every morning, they lined up at 6 a.m., saluted a flag they were never allowed to touch, and repeated a pledge none of them fully understood. Then the lessons began. Not in arithmetic or literature, but in code memorization, false identity construction, and emotional suppression. Loyalty means obedience without recognition. Memory is only as useful as it is deniable. Pain is just information. These weren't slogans on posters. They were the curriculum. The mind split. By age 12, USEO spoke 4 languages. Fluently. Kazan, Japanese, Mandarin, and English, with regional dialect training so precise that her accent could pass for native in 5 cities she had never even seen on a map. She could disassemble and reassemble a handgun in under 30 seconds. She could forge a passport by hand using outdated materials. She could lie to your face and make you apologize for questioning her. But she couldn't remember what flowers her mother used to grow. That memory, among many others, had been wiped away on purpose. Part of the process involved memory distortion therapy, sessions where children were forced to confess, to imaginary crimes and then punished for them, just to train the brain to associate falsehood with truth. USEO had been punished dozens of times for a crime she never committed. I fed secrets to foreign spies. They beat her for that lie. And eventually she began to believe it. The mask of a stranger. At 18, she graduated the program. But graduation didn't mean freedom. It meant deployment. She was given a new name, Kimberly Yuen. A new birth date. A new passport. And a new face, not surgically, but behaviorally. She studied makeup techniques from Japanese fashion magazines. She learned how to tilt her chin just slightly in photographs to appear docile. She trained in stage acting, not for performance, but to control every twitch of emotion in high-pressure environments. Her handlers called her the ghost mirror, because she could become anyone and reflect nothing. First mission, the dry run. Before Flight 609, before the cassette bomb, before the poison cigarettes, there was a dry run. July 1984. Kimberly and her senior handler, codename Victor Sun, were assigned to infiltrate 3 countries in Europe posing as a Japanese father and daughter. The mission was simple: test border security, gather diplomatic gossip, and memorize customs protocols. Kimberly was handed a passport that read, Isabel Rayner. She practiced smiling in hotel mirrors until her face no longer twitched from fatigue. She laughed at dinner tables, asked for directions, fumbled her English just enough to seem authentic. Nobody suspected a thing. When she returned to Sector 12A, her debriefing officer said only one sentence. You have now become useful. Mission 609. The final assignment came in fall 1987. There was no meeting. No official document. Just a brown envelope slid under her door. Inside, a flight itinerary from Houston to Miami. 2 Canadian passports. A modified Sony Walkman with explosive components. 1 instruction. Plant. Depart. Disappear. No explanation. But she understood. The goal was not simply to destroy the plane. It was to unravel trust, to destabilize America on the eve of international talks. To remind the world that even the most powerful nations can be made to bleed by silence. And she obeyed. Not out of hate, but because she had been trained to never ask why. She never considered herself evil. She thought of herself the way a hammer might, not responsible for the nails it strikes, only for being accurate. But as the plane lifted off that October afternoon, as she and Victor disembarked in Florida Keys, calmly boarding another flight, something in her chest pulsed. Not guilt, but the faintest recognition of something she had long been taught to forget. What it felt like to be human. The girl who lived, why they let her stay. She didn't just survive the poison. She survived the system, and that made her dangerous. The trial was over. The world had moved on. But Kimberly Yuen still woke up every morning to a world that didn't know what to do with her. She was sentenced to death on March 27, 1989, 115 counts of murder, aviation sabotage, and conspiracy against the state. The courtroom was filled with silence when the judge pronounced the words. Kimberly didn't cry. She didn't blink. She simply nodded. Because deep down, she believed it too. She was never supposed to walk away from that plane. The sentence that never came. For 15 months, she sat in a federal holding facility in upstate Virginia. A single cell, maximum security, no mirrors, no pens without supervision. She waited for the knock. The one that would come at 3 a.m. The one that would end everything. But it never came. Instead, she got a visit. Not from a lawyer. Not from a guard. But from a man in a gray suit, carrying a folder labeled, Eagle Archive, Testimony Priority. He introduced himself as Alan Reeve, liaison from a National Intelligence Advisory Board. He said one sentence. We need you more alive than dead. The witness they couldn't replicate. Kimberly was the only surviving agent known to have been trained under North Casia's Unit 14, the psychological conditioning program once thought to be a Cold War myth. She didn't just know how the bombs were made. She knew who wrote the manuals, who built the devices, and what kind of speech pattern the trainers used to embed orders. That kind of intel couldn't be extracted by documents or second-hand defectors. Only a product of the system could describe its machinery from the inside out. Her mind, one internal report read, is an active archive and also a weapon, but only if it stays intact. So the death sentence remained on paper. But behind closed doors, a new plan was drawn. The secret agreement. On April 12, 1990, just weeks into the new presidential administration, Kimberly Yuen was quietly pardoned. No cameras. No press release. The official statement listed diplomatic leverage and long-term intelligence value as justification. Unofficially, there was more. Behind the scenes, North Cassia had begun denying everything. They claimed Kimberly never existed. That Flight 609's disappearance was either mechanical or staged. That the confession was forced. The girl, a Western actress. It was working, in parts of Asia and even among some fringe groups in Europe. And that's when the US realized, if Kimberly was executed, her story died with her. And if that happened, the truth became optional. The weaponization of a memory. So they changed tactics. Kimberly was offered a choice: disappear into witness protection, or stay and become a counter-propaganda figurehead. She chose something in between. She wrote, first under a pen name, a fictional memoir titled The Passenger's Shadow. Then a second book, I Was Trained to Forget. Neither mentioned countries. Neither used real names. But the implication was clear. The stories became quietly powerful tools. Her words were quoted in briefings. Excerpts passed through embassies. She became a human rebuttal. One intelligence memo called her the girl who outlived her mission and gave her guilt a purpose. But what about justice? There was public backlash. Victims' families felt betrayed. Advocacy groups called it hypocrisy. If she'd been a man, one father said during a news interview, they would have put him down and thrown away the name. But others saw nuance. Senator Caroline Bray, whose cousin was aboard Flight 609, said it plainly. Killing her doesn't bring anyone back. But letting her live keeps their story alive every single day. Kimberly never asked for sympathy. She avoided all public appearances. But in one internal interview with a Department of Justice historian, she reportedly said, I don't want forgiveness. I just don't want to be erased again. In the years that followed, Kimberly became invisible by design. She got married. She had children. She took another name. But for certain people in intelligence circles, her file never closed. Because somewhere in her mind still lived the floor plan of a training center no one could find, the tone of voice that broke children into tools, the exact shade of paint on the ceiling of a room where names were erased. She was a witness, a weapon, a woman who had once watched a plane fall from the sky and walked away from it. And the world, for reasons both strategic and deeply human, let her stay. The final echo, a life after silence. She lived. But what kind of life was it, when every breath carried the weight of 115 ghosts? By the time the world forgot her name, she had already begun forgetting it too. Not because she wanted to, but because it was safer that way. Kimberly Yuen had become many things. A spy, a suspect, a survivor, a symbol. But in the final chapter of her life, she became something far more difficult to define. She became a witness with no audience. A life in soft focus. In the quiet town of Redstone, Oregon, she was known simply as Anne Bellamy. A mother of two. A wife who made pancakes on Sundays and mowed her own lawn when her husband was away. She volunteered at the local library. Joined a book club. Watered her neighbors' plants when they traveled. There were no more interviews. No more files. No more aliases. But also, no more peace. Because no matter how ordinary the surroundings became, her past didn't fade. It echoed. The weight of memory. Kimberly never visited any memorials. Not for Flight 609. Not for the victims. Not for Victor. But she kept a single item hidden in a box at the back of her closet. A boarding stub, faded, torn, stained at the edges. Flight 609. Seat 21C. Issued to Isabel Rayner. She had never sat in that seat. But someone else had. And they had never made it home. Sometimes at night when the house was still, She would open the box, hold the ticket in both hands, and say the same 4 words. "I'm sorry you flew." The last words that were truly hers. In 2020, after nearly 3 decades of silence, Kimberly submitted a sealed manuscript to the National Archives under her legal name. The title, Echo After Echo, Confessions of a Used Life. The government never published it. But in 2023, after her death, a redacted version was released quietly to a handful of libraries. It wasn't a political book. It wasn't an exposé. It was a letter. To the families. To the world. And in some strange way, to herself. I was built to lie. I was trained to forget. But I remember everything. The way a child on the plane hugged his backpack twice before stowing it. The old woman who lent her neck pillow to a stranger in the row behind. The way the engines hummed when we walked away, calm, innocent, and doomed. I was never brave. I was never cruel. I was simply erased. But the ones who died, they live in me. The final interview, that never aired. In late 2012, a documentary team secured a one-on-one sit-down with Kimberly under tight clearance. The footage was never released. But one intern who worked on post-production kept a transcription of the final exchange. Interviewer, "Do you think you were forgiven?" Kimberly, pause, "No. And I don't think I should be." Interviewer, "Then what do you hope people remember?" Kimberly, "Not me. I hope they remember that silence is never neutral. That forgetting something doesn't make it disappear. That peace isn't built on burying the truth, but facing it even when it burns." A grave with no name. Kimberly died in her sleep in October 2025. Natural causes. Age 63. Her grave is unmarked in a federal protected site. No visitors allowed. No photos online. No obituary. But somewhere in the records of 3 nations, in transcripts stored deep beneath sealed archives, in the memories of 2 children who only knew her as Mom, she still exists. Not as a villain, not as a martyr, but as something far more uncomfortable. A reminder. Sometimes history doesn't ask for heroes or monsters. It just gives us people, broken, rebuilt, scarred, but alive. And in their survival, we're forced to ask ourselves, would we have done differently if we were made the same way?